I am an old man, and over the course of my long life, I have witnessed things no mortal should ever behold. Acts of cruelty so vile they freeze the blood. Supernatural horrors that defy all understanding. I've seen shadows stir where none should move, and heard whispers that echo in the silence of the night. Now I sit here in this cursed old chair to share what I've seen. Stories that will make your skin crawl and your heart race, if you dare to listen. I work at a funeral home. Some of the dead bodies are smiling. The next week we got more smiling corpses. Jasmine Thomas, 47, pronounced dead at the scene of a car accident. Eleanor Wu, 62, dead after a long battle with pancreatic cancer. John Ivanov, 23, dead from a mugging gone wrong. All smiling. Alan and I called the police, the coroner, the delivery people, but no one reported seeing the bodies smiling. There were police reports too, from the car accident and the mugging, but none of those mentioned a smile. It seemed certain. All the bodies had started smiling after they died, which didn't make a lick of sense. Alan started calling colleagues of his, even professors at the local college, but none of them knew. He started floating various theories. Maybe the coroner was using contaminated tools or substances that the body was having a post-mortem allergic reaction to. Maybe they were being stored at a slight incline, and that was moving the facial muscles. Of course, this didn't explain why the bodies started smiling again, even after we set their features, but we were grasping at straws. No one had a possible explanation for what was going on. I pondered all this as I pulled on my rubber gloves and started work on John Ivanov. I stared down at John, his pale face, his stubble-lined lips twisted into a smile. The grin somehow looked even more grotesque on his young face. I worked on autopilot. I yanked the corners of his mouth down into a deep frown. Then I grabbed the clear thread and, steadying my shaking hands, plunged the needle into his lips. I used double the number of stitches. Maybe that would stop the smile from reappearing, because despite all my work on Amber Reese's face, her smile had reappeared. We'd gotten an irate call from her sister at the funeral. "Hey, Sam, can you come here? Bit for a second?" Ben asked, from the other side of the morgue. Sure. I followed him over. He'd been working on another smiling body. An older woman, in her 50s or 60s. I didn't remember her name, as Ben had been in charge of her. Her file says she was 160 pounds when she died, he said. But she feels really light to me. I grabbed her by the shoulders and shifted her on the table a little. "Huh, yeah," I replied. "She does feel a little light." I grabbed her by her midsection and shook her a little more. Ben was right. If I wasn't looking right at her, I would have guessed this woman was no more than 100 pounds. "Let's weigh her again," I said. Maybe the coroner entered the wrong weight. So we rolled her onto the scale. When the number came up, my heart dropped. 97 pounds. There's no way this woman is 97 pounds, I said. "I know." I stared down at her. Slightly taller than average, with an average physique. She'd have to be rail thin to be 97 pounds, if she could even get to that weight at all. Ben told me he'd discuss it with Alan, and then continued preparing her for burial. I went back to working on John Ivanov. I tried to not even look at his face, just focusing on getting him ready, like it was as mundane as sweeping the floor or folding clothes. But then, as my hands worked, I had a moment of clarity. 5 smiling corpses had come in now. If it were just 1 or even 2, maybe it could be explained away as an allergic reaction or a deformity. or whatever Alan's theory of the day was. But 5, when, as far as we knew, this had never happened before. There was really only one explanation that suddenly hit me like a ton of bricks. Something was infecting them, maybe some sort of parasite or bacteria, maybe in the town's water supply. I suddenly had the mental image of a pale, leech-like creature slithering around in John Ivanov's mouth, stretching his lips into that hideous smile. Then something even worse occurred to me. If I touched their faces, was I now infected? Panic set in. My mouth felt itchy or stiff or something. I left John on the table and ran to the bathroom. I washed my hands over and over again. Of course, if it were infectious, it was probably too late, but I had to do something. Of course, when I got back to the morgue, John was grinning again. The stitches had snapped and a single drop of blood coated his lips. Fuck, fuck, fuck. I stared down at him, my entire world tunneling down into a single focal point. His mouth. I had to look inside his mouth and make sure there weren't any squiggling, writhing leeches in there. Holding my breath, I pushed my fingers into his mouth and yanked his jaw open. For a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of movement in the darkness of his throat. I grabbed my phone and turned the flashlight on. Hand shaking, I lifted it over his mouth and peered in. Nothing was there. I shone the flashlight all around, even lifting his lips to look at his gums and teeth. But I didn't see anything. I let out the breath I'd been holding. Get a grip. I closed his mouth. Then I forced myself to take a few deep breaths, slowly letting them out. Everything is fine. Stop scaring yourself. Calm down. I re-sewed his mouth shut, even though I knew it was probably futile. My entire body was shaking with tension, and I needed something to keep busy. As I worked, though, I noticed something else odd. Hadn't John Ivanov died in a mugging gone wrong? Hadn't he been stabbed? Yet his pale skin was as perfect as porcelain. No purple bruises, no stab wounds as far as I could see. Then again, he was dressed. Ben had done that earlier, so it was very possible that all his wounds were covered by clothes. Still, I'd dealt with a few victims of muggings and other violent crimes in my career, and none of them looked as pristine as John Ivanov did, even when fully dressed. Other than his deathly blue pallor, he looked as if he were in perfect health, just sleeping. I shuddered and loaded him into the cabinet, desperate to not be looking at him anymore. A few days later, we got a visit from the sheriff. He sat with us in Alan's office, arms crossed, giving each of us an icy glare. "I'm going to have to ask you to stop investigating this," he told us plainly. "What? Why?" Alan asked. "It's attracting too much attention," Sheriff Thompson replied. "I got a call from WBX the other day, and they want to do a story on it, asking all kinds of questions. We don't want people, outsiders, poking around in our business, you know." "With all due respect," Alan replied, "it seems like this kind of thing has never been documented before. One of the professors at Hawthorne wants to—" "No," Sheriff Thompson replied, cutting him off. "We don't want any studies conducted, nothing of the sort, okay?" "You can't make us to stop," Alan told him. "I can't," he agreed. "But let me ask you this, Alan. Do you like lawsuits? Because if there's a news story on WBX about smiling corpses, you better believe the families affected are going to be looking for someone to blame. And that someone is going to be you." A heavy silence filled the room. Alan averted his eyes. "Understood," he finally muttered quietly. "Good." And with that, the sheriff was gone. Alan cooled it on the investigation after that. I could tell it really bothered him. But the Moyner Funeral Home was his pride and joy. He'd bought it from the Moyners several years back, and he'd turned it from a small operation to one of the biggest funeral homes in the county. He didn't want a scandal or lawsuits more than anyone, so he shut up. We continued to receive more smiling corpses. We stayed quiet about it. Alan ordered some sort of industrial-strength adhesive, and when we used that on the lips instead of the thread, it seemed that the smiles didn't come back. And so for weeks, that's how we dealt with one of the most horrific things to happen in Clearwater, Pennsylvania. We glued corpses' mouths shut. 3 weeks had passed since the first corpse arrived. We'd received a total of 27 so far. Alan had stopped investigating and just continued buying more and more of the adhesive by the gallon jug. But I was getting really concerned at this point, so I continued to do investigating of my own, untraceable, anonymous stuff, so Alan wouldn't get mad at me, internet sleuthing and the like. All my investigations into their deaths came up as dead ends, so I turned to their lives. There didn't seem to be a common thread, however. The smiling victims were every age, gender, occupation, ethnicity, religion. They seemed to have absolutely nothing in common. Until I looked up their addresses. All the victims lived within a square mile of each other. I printed out a map of Clearwater and, in red pen, made a little dot where each of the smiling ones had lived. They formed a cluster on the west side of town, with several of them coming from the same street. Highview Lane, the street bordering the woods of the state park. I uncapped the red pen and wrote the date above each dot. Not necessarily their death date, but the date we'd received the body. From our internal records, that's when I came to a horrifying conclusion. The first several bodies, including Amber's, had come from Highview Lane. The next bunch had come from the streets surrounding it. The most recent ones, however, had come from the areas furthest from that street. In other words, it was spreading. The nexus was Highview Lane, with the smiling corpses spreading outwards towards the rest of town like some sort of virus. What the hell? The 3 most recent ones had come from only a half-mile away from the funeral home. I explained all of this to Alan in his office in a near whisper, with the doors closed. "It's spreading," I said, pointing to the map. "You're not supposed to be looking into this," he said angrily, although I had a feeling his anger was more about Sheriff Thompson than about me. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? But now that I know this, we have to do something." "Do what exactly?" "Tell the police, like Sheriff Thompson would actually help us," he scoffed. "And it doesn't seem like it's actually harming anyone. Clearly it's not killing people because all of them had a legitimate cause of death. Like a lot of the smiling bodies, they're from people who died of cancer." "So what? This thing is causing cancer?" "I don't know, but this isn't a coincidence." Alan buried his face in his hands and let out a groan. "If we tell everyone, there's gonna be a panic and I might go out of business." "So what? We just keep it a secret?" I asked. "I don't know. I honestly don't. I've never come across anything like this." He let out a sigh. "Just give me some time to think about it, okay? A few days. We'll figure something out." I left his office disturbed. Alan always did the right thing, even when it meant his business suffering. I remember last year, our car had gotten into an accident while transporting a body, and it had gotten a little damaged. He could have easily said the bump on her head was there when the body arrived, or tried to cover it with her hair and hoped they didn't notice. But he told them the truth, that we didn't package the body correctly and there was an accident. We lost half of the funeral expenses, but Alan believed in doing the right thing, or so I thought. We couldn't just keep this a secret. Something awful was happening here, and it was spreading. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. I drove down to that area of town myself to see if there was something, anything I could figure out. I wouldn't get out of the car in case there was something in the air. A virus, a pathogen, fungal spores. But I would drive around and see if anything struck me. Highview Lane was within a wealthy neighborhood, a development of McMansions that had been built last year. I kept the heat off to not let any sort of pathogen into the car and continued driving. It was only 9 o'clock, but everything appeared closed, neon signs for gas stations and convenience stores glowing brightly in the darkness. Everything was still, silent. Then I drove up the hill and turned onto Highview Lane. I stared up at the houses. They were so sterile and harsh-looking, white with trim and gutters painted black. The wood between the window panes was painted black too, making the house look more like a prison than a home. I'm not sure whether it was the wealth of the place, or some sort of sixth sense and instinctual feeling, but I felt unwelcome, like I was trespassing, like everyone in these houses was watching me, watching the beat-up sedans scutter along their pristine streets. I need to get out of here now. I could turn around in a driveway, but I felt like that could provoke someone. My headlights would be shining right in their windows. The cul-de-sac was only about 10 yards ahead of me anyway. When I got to the cul-de-sac, however, I froze. There were no houses here. Instead, the entire area had been cordoned off with chain-link fence. A sign hung from the metal, reading in big red letters, "Keep out." I rolled the car forward to get a better look. The site had clearly been prepared for building. Sure, the grass was long, but there weren't any trees, and the area was unnaturally flat. Within the fenced-in area, I saw two large rectangular holes. The basements had been dug out already, the foundations ready to be poured. But the developer had abandoned them. Why? This development had been in high demand. I'd driven past this area of town while they were building it, and the starting price of the homes had shot up more than 50% between breaking ground and finishing the last house. So if the demand was there, and there was money to be made, why did they just stop? Maybe they found something, I thought. Maybe they dug up something. Maybe they dug up a parasite or virus or some other kind of pathogen. I'd read that climate change was causing ice to melt in the Arctic, and it was releasing pathogens. Wasn't there some outbreak of something in Siberia several years back? Who was to say there weren't pathogens under the ground too, laying in wait, dormant, until someone dug them up? I desperately wanted to get out of the car and take a closer look, but I knew that would be a really bad idea, so I inched the car forward until my tires bumped the curb. Then I flicked on the high beams. I froze. The dirt wall of the left hole looked disturbed. The soil was rough and dark, rather than smooth and crusted over. Just an animal, I told myself, probably just a raccoon or something that fell down there and was scrambling to get out. Even though I told myself that, I hit the gas and sped home as fast as I could.